I'm John Barclay and welcome to the Fatality Free Future podcast.
My name is Holly Ferguson. This is the podcast where we explore the challenges and possibilities of creating a fatality-free future. The lives of people in work environments depend on controls working and leaders understanding how to verify them, not just inspect them. But how do we go about ensuring controls beyond compliance and use coaching to achieve better results? Alan Stevenson joins us again today. Alan, can you help set some context about why this matters, particularly when we look at worker fatalities in Australia and the most common mechanism of an incident?
The place to go is Safe Work Australia have an interactive website database, and it's got data for the last 10 plus years. I often use this if I'm doing safety leadership workshops or that kind of stuff, just to bring the reality to people. And sometimes it's just asking people around the room, on average, in the last 5 years, how many people do you think have died as a result of a workplace incident? Most people have no idea. And it ranges from 20, 30, to being close to the number. And then you can have a little exercise, and then you do the reveal. And one of them, there's 3 numbers that I've been using recently. So you can go onto the Safe Work Australia website and it will tell you in the year so far, 2026, particular date, how many people have died of a workplace incident in Australia. And I think the last time I looked for the last workshop, by the late February, 26th of February or something, 20 people have died as a result of a workplace incident in Australia so far this year. Then it goes, okay, so last year, how many people died? I think it's 179 people died as a result of a workplace incident in Australia last year. Then it gives you the 5-year average. So in the last 5 years, there's been an average of 191 people have died of a workplace incident. That's a big number. That's a lot of people. Then you have the conversation about, okay, for each one of those people, so that person is dead, but whose life has been impacted by that fatality. And that number of 191 gets very big very quickly. Is it 5 people per person? Is it 10 people per person? Is it... I know it sounds a bit numbery and a bit statistical, but you're beginning to get a sense of the magnitude and the impact of that fatality. Then you can look at gender, you can look at age, you can look at all sorts of things, one of them being the most common mechanism of fatality. And this is across all industries, and it's basically driving vehicles. It's courier drivers. It's people that drive as part of their profession. So you think, okay, that makes sense. That makes sense. Lots of people drive for the job, but why is that the number one? Why is that the number one mechanism for people dying at work in Australia? Why is that? Then you get into the regional conversation and the this and the that and all the rest of it. Then you go, so what are we doing? What are we doing to try and minimise that, reduce that? Are you ever going to get zero? That's another conversation. But that's the reality. And sometimes that hits people pretty hard, because unless you've been in a workplace that has experienced a fatality, then the reality of it is sort of lost on you. You might see something on a LinkedIn post or on the evening news or something, and you go, oh, that's sad. That's sad. But you don't know that person. You have no connection. You have no emotional connection to it.
And you sort of only, again, if you haven't experienced or been around those things, you only hear of a few situations that make it on the news or the newspaper or those sorts of things a year. And I use a lot of the information out of Safe Work Australia to help, for the same reason, just to help leaders understand, It may not have happened here, it may not have happened for you, it may not have happened in your business, but have a look at the profile here, have a look at the industry, have a look at the mechanisms, so driving being the number one, and then falling from height being the next, and being struck by a falling object, and then being trapped between moving equipment. These are all mechanisms. Then all of a sudden they can start to bring a connection to, well, we have that in our workplace. Like, we're in that industry, our people drive vehicles for whatever reason, whatever purpose, as a part of their work. We have people working from height, we have people working around moving equipment and rotating equipment, and then all of a sudden you start to recognise, just because it hasn't happened here, it doesn't mean that we're trying to manage our exposure to those things quite day in and day out. And the interesting, because you talked about age as well in there, and the other one I try and get people to think about, because we talk about training and competency being a really important factor in here, and it is. No one really recognises who's overrepresented in fatalities in the workplace around Australia, and it's the over 45. Right? So it's well over 50% of fatalities in the workplace from people over 45. So generally people who have been doing the work a long time, are very experienced in it, very competent in it, and they're overrepresented.
Yeah, I can remember years ago, John, I don't think I'd been here very long. It might have been my first or second year here in Australia. I was an HSE manager and doing stuff. And I can remember reading in the West Australian, I think it was on page 3, it was a small paragraph on page 3 or page 5 or something, small paragraph down in the bottom right-hand corner of the newspaper, and it described an incident of a 54-year-old mechanical fitter who'd been killed working on an elevated work platform, a scissor lift, just doing routine maintenance. And I can remember reading this document thinking, how on earth has that happened? How on earth has that happened? So someone who's 54, probably started his apprenticeship, 16, whatever, time served, early 20s, been doing this job as a mechanical fitter for 30-something years, right? And in a blink of an eye, he's not here anymore. And the other reality, I think, about, when you talk about fatalities, you'll say, listen, 191 population workforce, blah, blah, blah. It's not a massive number, right? Percentage-wise, it's not huge. So these things don't happen every day. And the likelihood of you being somewhere and being exposed or involved in a fatal event, it's not, statistically, it's not very high. And for many people, they go through their whole career and they don't suffer it. There might be the odd serious accident. I can remember one particular instance. I was working in Saudi Arabia. It didn't happen on my crew. There was 3 other crews working in Saudi, and suddenly someone came over the radio and said, we used to use these quads, really brilliant pieces of kit to troubleshoot, right? All the quads back to camp now. On one of the other crews, a quad rider had come off his quad and died. And that impact, although I didn't know who this gentleman was, but the impact on me was pretty profound. Just the reality of fatalities is, hopefully it doesn't happen where you are, and it's easy to become detached from the reality of it, but something's not worked, right? So why are people still dying if their job is driving a vehicle? Why are people still dying if their job is to work at heights? Why is that still happening?
And I think that's the whole premise leading to this conversation, is none of that's unknown. This is another conversation I'll have with leaders when I start to talk about the mechanism, that it's not unknown. Like, they've done the work. They know driving is a critical risk. They know working at heights a critical risk. They'll know, dropped objects are critical risk. They'll know working around mobile equipment. So they know, it's not unknown. And they've done the work. They've defined these things. They've defined the controls they want to use in here. And so something for me is still not working there. And when you look at all the work we've been doing with organisations, one of the things is, how are we actually checking and verifying these controls? Because you've put in all the hard work to identify what it is in your business, how it could happen, what's the possibility, how do we manage it, and how do we control it? So hopefully they've done the hazard identification really well, they've done the risk assessment well, they've defined their controls well. Now they're in the last part of that process, which is the monitoring and the verifying of controls. And I think that now becomes the second really next major critical part of that process as well, because that's where variation starts to happen, and that's where one day the controls are working really well and the next day maybe they're not.
Thank you both for giving context to this conversation today. I'd like to touch on what are the pitfalls of these general verification conversations, because like you say, John, something isn't going right. They might have done everything else well. They know what controls they should have in place, but why are they not in place sometimes, which is leading to these statistics we're seeing?
Yeah, look, I think there's a few factors, but I think fundamentally it becomes a bit of a checkbox exercise. So what I mean by that, and I don't want to undermine or trivialise the effort that goes into this process, but most of the verification tools are designed to say, is it present or not? You know, and I think that's one of the pitfalls here is that control in place? And they go, yep, and then they move on. And if you're looking at an organisation that's trying to monitor this statistically, like say, you know, they try and monitor things through gathering evidence and information, they'll look at all the, you know, they'll have 10 leaders going out frequently, going out and checking and filling out some verification processes and say, yes, I've gone and looked, I've gone and inspected, and yeah, I've marked them off as being present. And they'll go, well, we're 98% compliant. You know, we're doing these things, and 98%, and then bang, something goes wrong, and they're surprised. They're like, well, how can we, like, we're doing these things all day, every day, and the 98%, 99% of the time that we're doing really well. But to me, I don't think that tells the whole story about this process, just because I've gone out in one moment in time and said that something's present. You know, I think that's one of the major pitfalls in the verification process is we're just focusing on whether it's present or not.
Yeah, and I know we've spoken about this in a previous conversation, is the routine piece of it. And I'm with you, John. There's a script that people follow, right? So they get, you know, the checklist. There's a script, you know, follow the script, have that conversation. The skill is being able to listen to what's being said and then be able to pause and explore. And that doesn't happen sometimes. Again, it's a recent experience. I was out and about with someone, bless him, lovely guy, great person. But there was a few things that happened during this interaction and during the debrief. And I said, you know, such and such said something during that conversation. He said, and I can't remember exactly what it was, but I said, he said this. What did you hear? What were you listening for? And he was just listening for some kind of response that could help him fill in the checklist. I said, can I tell you what I heard? And I said, I heard he was concerned about something, he wasn't quite comfortable about something, and it was an opportunity. I said, had you been really, really listening and interested in what the person was saying, you would have heard the concern. I heard the concern behind his response. And that's something that they missed.
And it sounds like you're coming at that from your coaching perspective.
Yeah.
So, question to both of you. Can you help us understand how coaching can strengthen these conversations and maybe a little bit of the process that you would go through?
I mean, coaching fundamentally is about facilitating a conversation for learning and improvement. And I think when you practice that and you step into that, the conversations change. I find for myself when I'm either in my role as an organisational leader versus now I'm a leadership coach, I'm noticing more how my curiosity is different. So when I'm in my leadership role, I can sometimes default into being clear, setting the right expectations, following up and giving good feedback, and go into those more traditional transactional type activities. But then when I'm put in a position to be someone's coach, I instinctively now listen and not just listen to what's being said, but listening to what's behind it. So it allows me to ask a better question next time. If I'm going to go out and verify controls, there's more to verifying a control to me than it just being present. Where I try and help people think about the verification of controls is, yes, is it present? That's the obvious place to start. But now, what else am I curious about? Do people understand it? Like, are they able to explain to me what the control is and what the control's doing and how it's protecting them and the way it works? And unfortunately, we assume that just because they've put it in place, they understand what it's there for. The next one for me is, well, is it being followed all the time? And then we can get into some other conversations about, is it difficult or is it not, or is it impossible to follow? That's where that can open up the curiosity. Is it being followed? So are they following the control? Are they using the control the way it's designed? And then the last one, is it actually effective in the protection part of whatever the energy source is? So it goes back to, is the hazard actually well identified in the first place? So for me, coaching changes the conversation because it inherently brings a bit more curiosity to what's happening.
And it's that, yes, for me, John, it's the critical thinking piece. It's just nudging people, disrupting people from, tick, it's in place, tick, 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 it's all there, we're all good, lovely. And it sort of doesn't account for the dynamic nature of the workplace. And again, it's a recent experience, heavy engineering, moving some stuff. So they had some overhead cranes. They weren't lifting it above head, they were just lifting it to move it, but it was a 6-ton, this piece of equipment weighed 6 tons. So I'm talking to the Boilermaker about access and lifting and barricading and access and all of these things. And he said, I've got someone here as a spotter. And I said, so what are the controls? So this critical risk, lifting and all this kind of stuff. What are the controls? And then I went back, I wasn't sure, so I went back and spoke to someone. I said, when they're lifting using the overhead gantry cranes and all that kind of stuff, what are the controls around mechanical lifting? And he said barricading or something, I can't remember what it was. And then I found a poster on the wall said for lifting access control, right? So the control was to control access. It doesn't say put barricading up, right? Access control. I said, so how do you control access to this area? Oh, well, I've got someone a spotter. Yeah. Okay. So there's a few other nuances around the controls that the organisation said should be in place, which opens up, there's a bit of interpretation. So you might interpret access control as hard barricading and flashing lights and horns and all sorts of stuff going on. Or I've just got someone over there making sure nobody walks into the area, which is probably enough. It could be okay. But you need to understand what the control is intended to do and what the activity is that you're doing and what's the hazard and what's the risk and what could go wrong. What's the worst that could go? What's the worst thing that could go wrong is one of my favourite questions.
And I think, the spotter's a great example. The amount of times I've had conversations with helped shape conversations with leaders and their teams around the spotter being a common control. Is let's just be a bit more curious around the spotter then, right? Because if
how many times has a spotter been killed?
How many times has a spotter been the one killed in this situation?
Yeah.
Also, how many times do we see a spotter multitasking? Is now actually more of a TA,
yes,
helping out rather than actually spotting.
Yeah.
So again, I think it's just more the coaching conversation for me when it's done really well and when it's fostered is that it's just digging a bit deeper. So one thing I wanted to touch on is, we talk about coaching asking good questions. So I've seen critical risk management processes, critical control conversations. You talked about a poster. Amount of times I've seen a poster out prompting this is, look, leaders, we want you to go out and do your critical control verification. We want you to ask these 3 questions. We want you to ask, what are the critical risks? What is it that could kill you? What are your controls? And how do you know they're working? And on the surface, I'm like, cool, okay, they're sort of open leading, they're good questions. But it becomes a checkbox process in itself anyway, because it becomes a bit just routine again. We're talking about routine, and those questions aren't any good if you're not inherently curious about what I'm hearing. So because the question's not the problem, it's listening to what people are saying back to it. So if I say, what are the critical risks? And they say slips, trips and falls. And I'm, well, hang on a minute. Let me, because that's just that's an outcome of something. Something's missing here. Let me go back and be a bit more inquisitive about this to see what's really going on. The other thing I noticed too is we talk about autopilot a lot in people doing the work, but they also do that when we ask the same questions. Or like if every leader comes out and stops Alan every time and says, "Hey, Alan, what are your critical risks? What are your critical controls? How do you know their work?" Alan learns what to say to make John go away. All right. So, their pinch points are working at height and dropped objects. Okay, what are your controls? Oh, it's this, and then it's this, and this. And people get into this automatic response. And I guess that's the challenge with the verification process, is it has a checkbox to go through. Then to try and avoid it being too much of a checkbox, they want you to ask these questions, which in itself starts to become a checkbox. And we're trying to create a coaching conversation through process rather than through purpose. Purpose and skill. So the skill is, the process isn't just to go out and ask questions. The skill is to be curious and to listen and to ask the next question that creates meaningful dialogue and learning.
Final question to you both. Do you think you need to consider a balance between being too prescriptive versus too generic when you're either asking questions or receiving answers back around controls?
Yeah, I mean, my point of view, and everyone's got a slightly different point of view on how to go out, but I guess what I try and like to do is I like to ask a fairly big, broad question up front. So what do you see here, or what are your thoughts about this work? I tend to try and ask as big a, broader, open, generalised question as possible, because it does give me a little bit of an insight to where that person's mental thinking goes and where their process goes. And depending on what that is, then I might ask a little bit more of a leading type question to get some specifics going. And people will say, you should always ask open questions and those sorts of things. Yeah, I get that. But sometimes even asking a closed question at the right time can start up a conversation, especially if you're curious about their response. If they give a yes to something, then I want to know, tell me more about your thinking. So getting into specifics is really, really helpful, because that's where you get a good understanding of things. But sometimes you can start in a more generalised way just to see where people go. And I guess the story I tell to help people think about the different questions and the value you get from a response. So I run focus groups for culture diagnostics and try to understand cultural norms. And running focus groups, I generally used to start with two questions. One is, so what do you like about working here, and what don't you like about working here? So for me, they're open, but open leading. They're sort of leading. I get a list on both. I get a bunch of stuff around what they like about working here. But then when I actually think about it, I don't really know which ones were important. I don't really know which ones resonated the most with people, because I let it. I asked what's good and I asked them for what's bad, and I got a list. When I start, so what's it like working here? They then lead it. They then, they tell me a bunch of good things or they tell me a bunch of bad things. So I know whatever they've told me is what's meaningful for them. So the art in verification for me in this process is asking a question that gives you a sense of what's their point of view and what's their perspective. So what do you think? What do you see? What's working for you? Then what's not working for you? So then start working your way down the level of specificness.
And I think, you said it earlier, John, we said it earlier about the script and the predictability of it. And even the way the lists have conditioned people. And it was something that foreman, a superintendent, said to me, it must have been about a year ago. I was doing a little bit of an exercise with them. I had the closed question bit. I said, turn that closed question into an open question. And for many people, they struggle because, and he said to me, Alan, actually taking us through that exercise, I've realised we're conditioned to think in closed questions. We're conditioned to think yes or no. And through that process, we're conditioning people in the front line to answer yes or no. So we're all conditioned to go, is it there or is it not? And there's no space for, what could make it even better? What could make it more safe? What could make it safer? The creativity piece is missing, because the objective is to fill out the form, go back to the office, enter it into the computer, get my KPI, get my numbers, do all of that stuff, which is useful, right? Which is useful. But again, I've been on site where they've had some incidents and they've gone out and asked for more. Oh, we've just had an incident, so we need more CCVs, or we need more. And I can remember doing this piece of work for somebody, and suddenly they had this huge spike in safe observations. And I went, that didn't coincide with you having these incidents, did it? So, yes. I said, so you got what you asked for then, eh? More observations. We need more observations. Yeah. So they get more observations. I said, what are you going to do with that data? Right. So I think sometimes it's data driven. It's, we'll get more, we'll have less. But I think the conditioning, for me, the conditioning is a binary thing. So we're conditioned to ask questions in a binary way. We're conditioned to respond in a binary way. And there's no space really for thinking and creativity and opportunity. And we're not creating space. We're closing it down.
Yeah, and I think organisations inherently sort of struggle with this. Well, we've got to sort of set an expectation. So we want you to do 2 a day or 1 a day or whatever a week. And when leaders genuinely and authentically care about preventing fatalities at work, today, with the work I've got going on, I might need to do 3 or 4 really high quality critical control verifications because that's the work I've got on today. And tomorrow, I might only need to do 1. So I think we need to help people understand why they're doing it, value the purpose of why they're doing it, try to make it less I know gathering data can be a bit binary in nature, but it's not, to me, that's the secondary part of this process, and we need to help. And for me, that's why coaching verifications is such a powerful method, because the coaching does try and bring people's mindset around why they're doing it and the benefit. I mean, one of the most common questions I'll ask at the end of it, so how did you find that, and what did you get out of doing that differently? Because when people can connect to the impact on them and the process or their teams, then they're more likely to do it next time, not just because I'm being told to do it, but that was really valuable. I got a lot of benefit out of that, and we got a lot of learning. We made a significant improvement. So if I can put that level of effort, curiosity into my process, then yes, it might have taken me just a few minutes longer, but I got a much better outcome from that.
And sometimes I'll even say to them again, because they're in the same place doing the same thing every day, and you've got one CCV to do a day. I said that's fine. Do your checklist bit, but just once during the week, go and have a really, really big conversation. You'll do the routine stuff. You'll get that stuff done. And then why don't you say, hey, John, is it okay if I come and do a CCV in your area tomorrow? And you can come and do one in mine. Yeah. Oh, we can do that? Yeah, but I don't know what he does. You don't have to know.
I think that's one of the benefits when you don't know. You ask great questions.
Very true. Alan and John, thank you both for sharing your insight around this area of coaching and verifications.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Fatality Free Future podcast. Head to our Fatality Free Future Hub on barclays.com for more information and to access everything we spoke about in this episode.